It was a cold October day in 1874 when the unthinkable happened in the mud-slicked streets of Leadville, Colorado. A crowd of rough miners had gathered not for gold, but for a cruel spectacle. A woman, bound and humiliated, her head hidden beneath a dirty burlap sack. The auctioneer claimed she was a monster, worth less than the whiskey in his flask. But then came Dylan Edward, a mountain man with nothing but a silver dollar and a conscience. He bought her to save her, expecting nothing. But the moment the deal was done, and she finally spoke, the silence of the mountains shattered. That single dollar didn't just buy a wife, it bought a secret that would bring a war to his doorstep. This is the true, untold story of the Dollar Bride. The wind biting through the pass above Leadville, Colorado, didn't carry the scent of pine or fresh snow. It carried the stench of sulfur, unwashed bodies, and desperation. It was late October, 1874. The boomtown was a festering wound on the side of the Rockies, a place where men came to get rich and usually died owing money to the company store. Dylan Edward hated coming down from the high country. At 34, he carried the weariness of a man twice his age. He was a trapper by trade, a ghost by reputation. He stood 6'3" in his elk-hide boots, his shoulders broad enough to span a doorway, his face buried beneath a thick beard that was the color of rusted iron. He wasn't a man who sought trouble, but trouble had a way of sniffing him out, usually because he was the only man in a 50-mile radius who didn't drink himself blind or gamble away his earnings. He had come for flour, salt, and ammunition. He intended to be back on the trail to his cabin at Dead Man's Ridge before the sun dipped behind the peaks. But the commotion outside the jagged framing of the Silver Dollar Saloon stopped him cold. A wagon had pulled up, the wheels caked in red clay mud. A man stood on the buckboard, a man Dylan recognized instantly as Jebediah Crouch. Crouch was a scavenger, a man who peddled in indentures, a polite legal term that, in these lawless parts, barely masked the reality of human trafficking. He brought women from the East who had fallen on hard times, promising them jobs as seamstresses or cooks, and sold their contracts to the highest bidder in the mining camps. Usually the women were paraded around in their Sunday best to drive up the price, but today the crowd wasn't cheering in lust. They were laughing in confusion. "Step right up, you filth!" Crouch bellowed, his voice raspy from cheap tobacco. He waved a cane in the air. "I got a special lot today." Not for the faint of heart. Not for the weak of stomach. Dylan tightened his grip on the burlap sack of flour over his shoulder. He should walk away. It wasn't his business. But he saw what was standing next to Crouch. It was a woman. At least the shape suggested a woman. She wore a dress made of grey wool that was 3 sizes too big, stained and torn at the hem. Her hands were bound in front of her with rough twine. But it was her head that drew the stares. A thick, grain-feed sack had been pulled over her head and tied loosely at the neck. She stood perfectly still, shivering slightly in the biting wind. She looked less like a human being and more like a piece of discarded livestock. "What's the matter, Crouch?" a miner shouted from the front row. "She got 2 heads under there." The crowd roared with laughter. Crouch spat a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the wheel of his wagon. "Worse," he crowed. "I'm doing you boys a favor. This one, she's a worker. I'll give her that. Strong as an ox. But face-wise, she's a curse. A fire took half her face when she was a babe. It's a visage that'll sour milk and stop a clock. I keep the sack on so the horses don't spook." The cruelty of the statement hung in the cold air. The woman on the wagon didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She just stood there, a statue of humiliation. Dylan felt a familiar heat rising in his chest. He had seen bears tear apart wolves. He had seen avalanches bury cabins. But he had never seen anything as ugly as Jebediah Crouch, smiling at the misery of another. "So who's brave enough?" Crouch yelled. "I ain't asking $50. I ain't asking $20. Who will give me $5 for a strong back and a blind eye to the rest?" Silence fell over the street. In a town starved for women, a silence like that meant only one thing: fear. Superstition ran deep in the minds. A cursed woman was bad luck. $3, Crouch tried, his desperation showing. Come on. She can scrub floors. She can chop wood. The woman shifted her weight. For a second, just a second, the wind pressed the sack against her face. Dylan, watching with eyes trained to spot a deer in a thicket from 100 yards, saw the outline. There was no monstrous deformity he could see, just the curve of a nose, a chin. "She's a mute, too," Crouch added, playing his last card to explain her silence. "Won't talk back, won't nag. $3. "I wouldn't pay a nickel for a spook," someone yelled, throwing a clump of mud that splattered against the woman's skirt. That was it. The line had been crossed. Dylan dropped his sack of flour. It hit the boardwalk with a heavy thud. He stepped off the wood and into the mud, his heavy boots squelching as he parted the crowd like a ship breaking ice. The miners, sensing the shift in the air, scrambled out of his way. Dylan Edward was known to break arms when the mood took him. He stopped at the edge of the wagon. He looked up at Crouch, his blue eyes cold as a glacial lake. "The show's over, Crouch," Dylan grumbled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the chests of the men standing nearby. "Edward," Crouch sneered, though he took a half step back. "Didn't know you came down from the clouds today. You want to buy? Or you just blocking the view?" "I'm stopping a cruelty," Dylan said. "She's for sale, Mountain Man. It's legal. Signed contract." Crouch waved a piece of paper. "Unless you're buying, move on." Dylan looked at the woman. She had turned her covered head toward him. She couldn't see him through the heavy weave, but she sensed his presence. She sensed that the laughter had stopped. "She ain't worth nothing to these men, Crouch. You humiliated her enough," Dylan said. "Business is business," Crouch spat. "Make an offer." Dylan reached into his vest pocket. He didn't have much. The winter fur yield had been low. He pulled out a single, heavy silver coin. A Morgan silver dollar, minted just that year. It shone bright against the dirt of his palm. $1, Dylan said, "for the contract. And you get out of town before I decide to show these boys what you look like with a sack on your head." The tension in the street was thick enough to cut with a bowie knife. The miners, initially eager for a show, now watched with bated breath. This was a different kind of entertainment. A standoff. Crouch looked at the silver dollar, then at Dylan's massive hands, one of which was resting casually near the hilt of the hunting knife on his belt. He looked at the crowd, realizing he had lost them. If he refused, Edward might just take the woman anyway, and Crouch would leave with a broken jaw and no money. $1? Crouch scoffed, trying to save face. "For a human life. That's charity, Edward." "That's $1 more than you're going to get from anyone else," Dylan countered, "and it's the price of you leaving Leadville with your teeth." Crouch snatched the coin from Dylan's hand, biting it theatrically to check its authenticity. "Sold," he snarled. "She's your problem now, Bear Man. Don't come crying to me when you see what's under that hood. No refunds." He untied the lead rope from the buckboard railing and threw it at Dylan. Dylan didn't catch it. He let it fall in the mud. He wouldn't lead her like a dog. Crouch whipped his horses, eager to put distance between himself and the mountain man. The wagon clattered away, spraying mud, leaving Dylan alone in the circle of onlookers with the woman. "Show us the face, Edward," a drunken miner shouted. "Let's see the monster." Dylan turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the crowd. He didn't say a word. He just looked at them, one by one, until the shouters looked down at their boots, suddenly finding the mud very interesting. The crowd dispersed, grumbling, disappointed they didn't get their freak show. Dylan turned to the woman. She was trembling violently now. Whether from the cold or terror, he couldn't tell. He stepped closer, careful not to make sudden movements. "Ma'am," he said softly. The change in his tone from the growl he used on Crouch was startling. "My name is Dylan. I ain't gonna hurt you." She didn't move. "I got a cabin about a 6-hour ride up the ridge. It's warm. There's food. You can stay there until we figure out where you belong. But we gotta move. The snow is coming." He reached out, intending to remove the sack. "Let's get this thing off you so you can breathe." She flinched, jerking back so hard she almost fell off the boardwalk. Her hands, still bound, came up to clutch the coarse fabric at her neck. She shook her head frantically. Dylan paused. Crouch had said she was hideous, scarred by fire. Maybe she was ashamed. Maybe she believed she was a monster. He lowered his hand. "All right," he said gently. "All right. You keep it on if it makes you feel safe. But I'm cutting these ropes." He drew his knife. She stiffened, but held still as he sliced the twine, binding her wrists. Her hands were red and raw, the skin chafed. They were slender hands, he noticed, not the hands of a woman who had ploughed fields or scrubbed floors all her life, as Crouch had claimed. They were delicate. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded once, a small, jerky motion. Dylan led her to his horse, a massive roan gelding named Buster. He helped her mount. She felt light, frail. He swung up behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to steady her, careful to keep his distance as much as possible. The journey out of Leadville was slow. They climbed the switchbacks, leaving the smoke and noise of the town behind. The air grew thinner, cleaner. The aspen trees were shedding their last gold leaves, creating a carpet on the trail. For 3 hours they rode in silence. Dylan was used to silence. He craved it. But this silence felt heavy. He had just bought a woman for $1. He, a man who could barely take care of himself, was now responsible for a crippled, mute outcast. "What have I done?" he thought. "I'm a fool." The sun began to set, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and orange. They reached a plateau where Dylan usually watered his horse. He dismounted and helped her down. She stumbled, her legs weak from the redet and lack of food. Dylan guided her to a flat rock. "Sit," he said. "I got some jerky and a canteen." He handed her the water. She lifted the sack just enough to expose her chin and mouth. He politely turned his back, giving her privacy to eat and drink. He busied himself checking the horse's hooves. "I know you can't speak," Dylan said to the air, his back still turned. "Crouch said you were mute. That's fine by me. Words usually just cause trouble anyway. But you should know up here, you don't have to hide. The mountains don't judge." He heard the rustle of the sack being lowered, then the cap being screwed back onto the canteen. "I am not mute, Mr. Edward." Dylan froze. He dropped the horse's hoof and spun around. The voice, it wasn't what he expected. It wasn't the coarse, broken rasp of a downtrodden servant. It was melodic, soft, and possessed a clarity that sounded like a silver bell ringing in a canyon. It was the voice of an educated woman, refined and terrified, yet holding a steel core of dignity. But it wasn't just the tone. It was the words, and the familiarity of it. It hit him like a physical blow, triggering a memory from a life he thought he had buried in the ashes of the Civil War 10 years ago. "And I am not a monster," she continued. She reached up and grabbed the coarse fabric. With a slow, deliberate motion, she pulled the sack off her head. Dylan braced himself for the scarring Crouch had described. He braced himself for a ruined face. The sack fell to the ground. Dylan's breath hitched in his throat. There were no scars. There was no fire damage. She was stunning, but she was terrifyingly pale, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of emeralds, eyes that were currently red-rimmed from crying. Her hair, matted and dirty now, was a deep, fiery auburn. But Dylan wasn't staring at her beauty. He was staring at her because he knew her. Not personally, but he knew who she was. He had seen her face in a tin-type photograph inside a dead captain's pocket watch at the Battle of Antietam. He had seen her likeness in the newspapers years ago, listed under the high society columns of Boston. You're Sarah Jane McAllister," Dylan whispered, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. She looked at him, her eyes widening in shock. "How do you know my name?" "The railroad heiress." Dylan stepped closer, his mind racing. "You went missing 2 years ago. They said you were dead. They said you fell off a steamer in the Atlantic." Sarah Jane shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I didn't fall, Mr. Edward. I was taken." She looked at the rugged mountain man, her eyes searching for safety. "And if you know who I am," she whispered, her voice trembling, "then you know that the men who sold me to that auctioneer, they are still looking for me, and they will kill anyone who finds me." Dylan looked down at the dollar bride standing in the snow. He realized then that Crouch had kept the sack on her, not to hide her ugliness, but to shed her identity. To hide a stolen prize that was too hot to sell in the open. Dylan Edward had just bought the most dangerous secret in the West for $1. "Get on the horse," Dylan said, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. "We need to get to high ground. Now." The mountain night did not fall. It crushed. As the last sliver of twilight vanished behind the Sawatch Range, the world was reduced to the cone of vision allowed by the moon and the rhythmic, laboring breath of the horse. Dylan Edward did not speak. He kept his rifle balanced across the pommel of his saddle, his eyes scanning the tree line, not for predators of the four-legged variety, but for shadows that moved like men. The woman, Sarah Jane McAllister, sat behind him, her arms wrapped tentatively around his waist. He could feel the heat of her fever through the thick wool of his coat. She was burning up, her body vibrating with exhaustion that went deeper than muscle and bone. They were climbing the Devil's Spine, a narrow switchback trail that separated the mining camps from the untamed high country. Here the air was thin enough to make a lowland man dizzy, crisp with the scent of pine resin and impending snow. "Keep your eyes closed if you get dizzy, Miss McAllister," Dylan rumbled over his shoulder. The wind snatched his words, but he felt her nod against his back. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crunch of hooves on frozen scree. "Don't call me that. That name, it feels like a ghost story." "What should I call you, then?" "Just Sarah," she said. "The Jane belongs to a girl who died in a cellar in Boston 2 years ago." Dylan tightened his grip on the reins. A cellar. The image curdled his stomach. He had heard rumors of the McAllister disappearance. It had been national news. The heiress to the Great Eastern and Pacific Railroad vanished into thin air. The papers speculated she had run off with a lover or fallen from a yacht. No one suspected she had been dragged into the hell of the indentured trade, passed from hand to hand until she ended up in a mud-hole town in Colorado under a feed sack. The ride took another 2 hours, a slow, agonizing crawl up the ridge. Dylan felt every shiver that racked her body. She was fading. He knew the signs of hypothermia and shock. If he didn't get her to a fire soon, the dollar he spent would be for a burial, not a life. Finally the trees broke. Nestled against a granite overhang that blocked the worst of the north wind sat his cabin. It was a sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs, chinked with moss and mud. A lean-to stable was attached to the side. Dylan halted the horse. "We're here." Sarah didn't answer. Her grip on his waist had slackened. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Dylan's chest. He dismounted quickly, his boots sinking into the drift of snow that had accumulated near the door. He reached up and grasped her waist. She slid from the saddle like water, her legs buckling the moment they touched the ground. Dylan caught her before she hit the snow. She was light, terrifyingly so. Underneath that oversized, filthy grey dress, she was skin and bone. He scooped her up into his arms, carrying her bridal style. She weighed less than a winter's haul of beaver pelts. He kicked the door open. The cabin was dark and smelled of stale wood smoke, cured leather, and dried sage. He carried her to the cot in the corner, a simple frame strung with rope and piled with buffalo robes. He laid her down gently. "Don't sleep yet," he commanded, his voice rough with urgency. He moved through the dark with the familiarity of a blind man in his own home. He struck a lucifer match against the stone hearth, the flare illuminating his bearded, worried face. He lit the coal oil lamp on the table, casting a warm, flickering yellow glow over the room. He turned to look at her. In the light, she looked like a broken porcelain doll. Her face, now free of the sack, but smeared with the grime of the road, was pale as milk. Her eyes were half closed, the emerald green dull and glassy. "Sarah," he said, kneeling beside the cot. He began to unbutton his heavy buffalo coat. "I need to get this fire roaring. But first, we need to get you warm." He looked at her wet, filthy dress. It was soaked with mud and the sweat of the horse. It was freezing against her skin. "Ma'am," he said, looking at the floor, his ears turning red beneath his beard. "I ain't no gentleman's valet, but that dress is killing you. It's wet and it's thin. I have a wool shirt and some dry breeches. They'll swallow you whole, but they're dry." Sarah looked at him. A spark of fear ignited in her eyes, the instinctive fear of a woman who had been property for 2 years. She clutched the collar of her rags. Dylan saw it. He stood up slowly and backed away, hands raised. "I'll leave the clothes here on the chair. I'm going to the stable to settle the horse. I'll be 10 minutes. You change. If you can't, you wrap yourself in that buffalo hide until you can." He placed a thick red flannel shirt and a pair of canvas trousers on the rough-hewn table. He grabbed the iron kettle and hung it over the kindling he had laid in the hearth, striking another match to start the blaze. 10 minutes, he repeated. He stepped back out into the biting wind, closing the heavy door behind him. He stood there for a moment in the cold, listening to the wind howl through the pines, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was a man who lived alone, because he understood the brutality of nature. He wasn't equipped for the brutality of men. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. Not from cold, but from rage. Who does this to a woman? He walked to the horse, his jaw set so hard his teeth ached. He had a war to fight now. He just didn't know the enemy's face yet. When Dylan returned, stomping the snow off his boots on the threshold, the cabin was transformed. The fire was crackling loudly, the pine logs popping and spitting sparks up the chimney. The air was beginning to thaw, carrying the scent of burning wood and the metallic tang of the heating kettle. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the cot. She had managed to change. Dylan's red flannel shirt hung on her like a master's robe, the sleeves rolled up 4 times to reveal her slender wrists. She had cinched the waist with a piece of rope. Her wet grey dress lay in a heap in the corner, a discarded skin of her past life. She held her hands out towards the fire, rubbing them together. Her hair, a tangled mane of deep auburn, dried in the heat, falling over her face like a curtain. Dylan moved to the small kitchen area, just a shelf and a wood stove. "Water's hot," he grunted, trying to keep his voice steady. "I got tea. Real tea. Not pine needle water." "Tea would be heaven," she whispered. He prepared 2 tin cups. He added a generous spoon of honey to hers. He walked over and handed it to her, careful not to let his fingers brush hers. She took the cup with both hands, bringing it to her face, inhaling the steam. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, the mask of trauma slipped, revealing a glimpse of the young woman she used to be. "Bergamot," she murmured. "Earl Grey." "Traded a French trapper for it last month," Dylan said. He pulled a 3-legged stool near the fire, sitting opposite her, nursing his own cup. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the wind battering the cabin walls and the hiss of the sap in the firewood. "Why?" she asked suddenly. She didn't look at him. She stared into the flames. "Why what? Why did you pay for me? Why did you bring me here? You could have left me. You saw the crowd. You saw the risk." She turned her head, her green eyes piercing him. "You don't look like a man who throws away silver dollars." Dylan looked down into his tea. "I don't like bullies, and I don't like cages. Is that all?" Dylan sighed. He set his cup down on the floorboards. "I was at Antietam," he said quietly. The word hung in the air. The bloodiest day in American history. A place where the ground drank more blood than rain. "I was a sharpshooter," Dylan continued, his gaze distant. "Union 2nd Corps. We were holding the sunken road. They called it Bloody Lane. By the end of it..." Sarah watched him, mesmerized. She saw the shadow that passed over his face, a shadow darker than the corner of the room. "There was a boy," Dylan said, "a lieutenant. He wasn't made for war. He had soft hands, like yours. He talked about poetry and steam engines. He died about 3 feet from me. Took a mini ball to the lung. Just bad luck." Sarah's breath hitched. She lowered her cup slowly. "He bled out slow," Dylan said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I tried to stop it, but there was nothing to do. He gave me his watch. Said to give it to his sister if I ever made it to Boston. Said her name was Sarah Jane. Said she was the only thing in the world that mattered." Dylan reached into his shirt, pulling out a leather cord that hung around his neck. Attached to it was not a crucifix, but a heavy gold pocket watch, dented by shrapnel. He unclasped the back and held it out to her. Sarah gasped, a sound of pure, agonizing grief. She reached out, her fingers trembling so violently she almost dropped it. She looked at the small, sepia tintype portrait inside the lid. It was her face, 5 years younger, smiling and innocent. "William," she choked out. Tears spilled over her cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the dirt on her face. You were with William." "He didn't die alone, Sarah," Dylan said softly. "I held his hand until he passed. I promised him I'd find you. But after the war, I was broken. I came west to forget. I never made it to Boston. I thought I failed him." He looked at her, his blue eyes intense. "When you took that sack off your head today, I saw him. You have his eyes. I didn't buy you for $1, Sarah. I paid a debt I've owed a ghost for 12 years. Son." Sarah clutched the watch to her chest, curling forward as sobs racked her body. It was the first time she had cried, really cried, since she was taken. It wasn't the weeping of a victim. It was the grieving of a sister. Dylan didn't move to comfort her physically. He knew she needed space. He just sat there, a silent sentinel, letting her pour out the pain she had bottled up in the darkness of her captivity. After a few minutes, the sobbing subsided into ragged breaths. She wiped her face with the sleeve of the flannel shirt. She looked at Dylan, and the fear was gone. In its place was something else. Trust. He wasn't just my brother, she whispered. He was my protector. When our parents died, Uncle Hiram took over the guardianship. But William stood between me and Hiram. Hiram St. John. Dylan said the name like a curse. The banker. He isn't just a banker, Sarah said, her voice hardening. He is a monster in a silk vest. When William died, I inherited the majority share of the railroad trust. Hiram was furious. He tried to have me declared insane. When that didn't work, he hired men to make you disappear. Dylan finished the thought. I was walking in the harbor district. A carriage pulled up. I woke up in the hold of a ship bound for New Orleans. They stripped me of my name, my clothes, my life. They sold me to a brothel madam, who sold me to a farm, who sold me to Crouch. She shuddered. I have been silent for 2 years, Dylan, because the one time I tried to speak, the one time I tried to tell a sheriff who I was. He laughed, and then he sent a telegram to my uncle. She looked at Dylan, her eyes wide with the memory of that betrayal. My uncle's reach is long. If he knows I am alive, he won't stop. He can't afford to. If I return to Boston, he goes to prison for life. He will burn this mountain down to get to me. Dylan stood up. He walked to the window, peering out through a crack in the shutters. The snow was falling harder now, a white curtain sealing them off from the world. Let him come, Dylan said. He turned back to her, and for the first time, Sarah saw the mountain man not as a savior, but as a warrior. The lethargy was gone. His posture was steel. You ain't a prisoner here, Sarah, and you ain't a ghost anymore. You're William's sister, and you're under my protection. He walked over to the wall where a second rifle, a Sharp's buffalo gun, hung on pegs. He ran his thumb over the stock. Rest now. Sleep. Tomorrow we don't run. Tomorrow we prepare. Because if Hiram St. John wants you, he's going to have to climb this mountain. And I promise you, the price of admission is going to be a hell of a lot higher than $1. Sarah looked at him, the firelight dancing in her emerald eyes. For 2 years she had prayed for a hero. She hadn't expected a mountain man with a beard full of snow and a heart full of old wars. But as she curled up on the buffalo robes, clutching her brother's watch, she finally felt something she thought she had lost forever. She felt safe. The snow came not as a blanket, but as a prison wall. For 3 months, Dead Man's Ridge was cut off from the world. The pass down to Leadville was buried under 10 feet of powder, and the wind howled like a banshee seeking entry into the small log cabin. In that isolation, time seemed to dissolve. The days were measured not by hours, but by the dwindling stack of firewood and the level of flour in the barrel. For Dylan Edward, a man who had spent a decade craving solitude, the presence of another human being should have been an intrusion. Instead, it became an anchor. Sarah changed. The terrified, starving creature he had lifted from the mud vanished, replaced by a woman of startling resilience. The physical recovery was slow. Dylan fed her broth made from rabbit and dried herbs until her cheeks lost their skeletal hollows. But the mental hardening was faster. She refused to be idle. She took over the mending, turning Dylan's tattered socks and torn shirts into functional garments again. She organized his chaotic pantry, labeling tins with charcoal from the fire. She swept the rough floor until the wood grain shone. But the true shift happened in the deep of January, on a day when the sun finally broke through the slate-grey clouds, blindingly bright on the snow. Dylan was cleaning his Sharp's rifle at the table, the smell of gun oil sharp in the small room. Sarah was kneading dough for biscuits, her sleeves rolled up, revealing arms that were gaining muscle. "Teach me," she said. She didn't look up from the dough. Dylan paused, the rag hovering over the barrel. "Teach you what? How to skin a beaver." "How to kill a man," she said. She stopped kneading and turned to him. There was no malice in her face, only a cold, practical determination. "If they come, Dylan, I will not be a sack on a wagon again. I will not go back to the cellar. I want to know how to stop them." Dylan looked at her for a long moment. He saw the tremble in her hands she was trying to hide. He nodded slowly. "Clean your hands. Put on your coat." They went outside. The cold was brittle, snapping in the nostrils. Dylan set up a row of pine cones on a fallen log 50 yards away. He handed her the heavy buffalo rifle. It was almost too big for her, the stock bruising her shoulder just by resting there. "It kicks like a mule," Dylan warned, standing close behind her, his voice low near her ear. "Don't fight it. Lean into it. You fight the recoil. It'll break your collarbone. You let it flow through you. It's just a push." He adjusted her stance, his large, calloused hands guiding her elbows, correcting the tilt of her head. For a moment, the proximity was overwhelming. He could smell the scent of the lavender soap he'd bought her, faint but stubborn against the pine air. He could feel the warmth of her back against his chest. "Breathe out," he instructed. "Squeeze between heartbeats." Sarah closed one eye. She focused on the pine cone. She thought of Crouch. She thought of her Uncle Hiram. She thought of the men who had laughed at her. Crack! The rifle roared, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. The recoil slammed her backward, but Dylan was there, a solid wall of muscle absorbing the impact so she didn't fall. Smoke obscured the view. When it cleared, the pine cone was gone, vaporized. Sarah lowered the rifle, her shoulder throbbing. She looked at Dylan, a fierce pride burning in her eyes. "Again," she said. They spent the next 6 weeks drilling. She learned to load, to clean, to judge windage. She learned to use his Colt Navy revolver for close quarters. She learned to walk in snowshoes without tripping. She became a shadow in the woods, just like him. But as the skills grew, so did the tension between them. It wasn't the tension of danger, but of something unspoken. One evening in late February, a blizzard raged outside. They were eating a stew of venison and potatoes. The fire cast long, dancing shadows. "The thaw is coming soon," Dylan said, breaking the silence. "The pass will open in a few weeks." Sarah stopped eating. She put a spoon down. "And then? Then we have decisions to make. We can't stay here forever. Your uncle, he's a powerful man. He'll have hired Pinkertons, bounty hunters, men who track for a living." "I'm not leaving," Sarah said quietly. "Sarah, you're an heiress. You have a life in Boston. You have a fortune." "I have a target on my back in Boston," she countered, "and a fortune is what got me sold for $1. I don't want the money, Dylan. I want the peace. I found it here." She stood up and walked around the table. She stopped beside him. Dylan didn't look up. He stared at the grain of the wood table, his heart hammering. "You saved my life," she whispered, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "But you did more than that. You gave me back my voice." "I just did what was right," Dylan gruffed, his voice tight. "Was it just duty?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is that all I am? A debt to a dead soldier?" Dylan looked up then. He looked at the woman who had survived hell and come out standing. He looked at the firelight catching the red in her hair. He wanted to tell her that she was the only thing he had ever been afraid of losing. He wanted to tell her that the $1 he spent bis to Denrot was the best bargain in the history of the world. But he was a mountain man with nothing but a cabin and a gun. She was Sarah Jane McAllister. "You're safe here, Sarah," was all he managed to say. "That's what matters." She looked at him with a mix of disappointment and understanding. She squeezed his shoulder once, then pulled away. "Safety isn't enough, Dylan. Not anymore." She went to her side of the room, leaving Dylan alone with the fire, and the gnawing feeling that the greatest danger wasn't the men coming up the mountain, but the breaking of his own heart when she eventually left. March brought the thaw. The world turned from white to a muddy, slushy brown. The sound of dripping water replaced the howling wind. The pass was open. Dylan became vigilant. He slept in shifts, often sitting up in the loft with the shutters cracked, watching the trail. He knew that if Hiram St. John was as ruthless as Sarah said, the silence wouldn't last. It broke on a Tuesday morning. Dylan was chopping wood near the stable. The air was crisp, smelling of wet earth. Suddenly the birds in the lower valley stopped singing. Dylan froze, the axe mid-swing. He lowered it slowly. He listened, not with his ears, but with the instinct honed by years of hunting. The rhythm of the woods had changed. Something foreign had entered the ecosystem. He whistled, a low, two-note call that sounded like a mountain chickadee. Inside the cabin, Sarah froze. It was their signal. Trouble. She moved instantly to the wall, taking down the loaded Sharps rifle. She moved to the back corner of the cabin, away from the windows, finding the firing loop Dylan had cut between the logs. Dylan leaned the axe against the stump and walked casually towards the front of the cabin, his hand resting near his Colt. He waited. 10 minutes later, a rider emerged from the tree line. He wasn't a rough miner or a dirty scavenger like Crouch. He rode a tall, black thoroughbred that looked well-fed. The man wore a long duster coat, a clean Stetson, and polished leather gloves. He rode with the arrogance of a man who carried the law, or the money, that bought the law, in his saddlebags. He stopped the horse 20 yards from Dylan. He smiled, a tight, thin expression that didn't reach his grey eyes. "Morning," the stranger called out. His voice was smooth, educated, southern drawl. "Morning," Dylan replied, not moving. "Looking for a man named Edward." "Dylan Edward. You found him." The stranger nodded, resting his hands on the saddle horn. "My name is Cole Hatcher. I represent the St. John Trust out of Boston." Dylan didn't flinch. "You're a long way from Boston, Mr. Hatcher." "Money travels," Hatcher said. He looked around the cabin, his eyes lingering on the closed door. "I'm looking for a piece of lost property. A woman, mental drift, likes to tell tall tales about kidnappings. We have a report she was seen heading this way with a local." "I live alone," Dylan lied, his face a mask of stone. Hatcher chuckled dryly. "Now, Dylan. Can I call you Dylan? We're both men of the world. I've been to Leadville. I spoke to a man named Crouch. He was very talkative after I broke 2 of his fingers. Then..." Hatcher reached into his coat. Dylan's hand twitched toward his gun. Hatcher raised a gloved hand peacefully and pulled out a leather pouch. He tossed it. It landed at Dylan's feet with a heavy clink. "Gold. $500 in double eagles," Hatcher said. "That's a fortune for a trapper. Enough to move to California. Buy a ranch. All you have to do is walk away. Go for a hunt. When you come back, the cabin will be empty, and you'll be a rich man." Dylan looked at the pouch in the mud. Then he looked back at Hatcher. "She ain't property," Dylan said. Hatcher's smile vanished. The mask dropped, revealing the killer beneath. "She is a liability, Mr. Edward, and you are standing in the way of progress. I have 6 men down the ridge. They are not as polite as I am." "Then you better call them up," Dylan said, "because I only dig graves in the afternoon." Hatcher stared at him, assessing the threat. He saw the way Dylan stood, balanced, ready. He decided a direct confrontation right now, one-on-one, was a coin toss he didn't want to take. "You're making a mistake," Hatcher said softly. "You can't save her. St. John owns the judges, the sheriffs, and the rails. You're just one man in a shack." "Get off my land," Dylan growled. Hatcher slowly turned his horse. "Enjoy the gold, Edward. Consider it a down payment on your tombstone." He spurred the horse and disappeared back into the trees. Dylan didn't relax. He waited until the hoofbeats faded completely. Then he snatched up the gold pouch and walked into the cabin. Sarah was standing by the window, the rifle in her hands, her face pale but set. She had heard everything. "He's coming back," she said. "Tonight," Dylan confirmed. He tossed the bag of gold onto the table. "He tried to buy me out. That means he wants this done quiet. But since I said no, he's going to burn us out." 6 men, Sarah said, "plus him. 7 against 2. 9. Dylan began pulling boxes of ammunition from under the floorboards. He looked at Sarah. "You remember what I taught you about the bottleneck?" "The trail narrows at the switchback," she recited. "They have to come single file." "That's where we hit them," Dylan said. "We don't wait here to be besieged. We go to them. We take the high ground." He walked over to her and placed his hands on her shoulders. "Sarah, listen to me. This isn't shooting pine cones. When you pull that trigger, a man dies. It stays with you. It changes you." Sarah looked up at him. She reached up and touched his beard, her fingers brushing his cheek. "They killed the girl I was, Dylan," she said, her voice hard as diamond. "The woman standing here, she's ready to do what is necessary." Dylan nodded. He felt a surge of fierce admiration. This wasn't the dollar bride anymore. This was a partner. "Grab the blankets," Dylan commanded, "and the dynamite I use for stump clearing. We're going to turn the Devil's Spine into a graveyard." They moved out into the twilight, leaving the cabin empty. They climbed the rocky outcrop overlooking the trail, burying themselves in the brush. The sun set, plunging the mountain into darkness. Hours passed. Then, below them, the clinking of bridles and the soft murmur of voices drifted up. Hatcher was coming, and he had brought his pack of wolves. Dylan lit the fuse on the first stick of dynamite, the spark hissing in the dark. He looked at Sarah. She had the Sharp's rifle leveled on the trail, her breathing steady. "For William," she whispered. "For us," Dylan whispered back. He threw the dynamite. The fuse hit the cap, and the night disintegrated. The stick of dynamite didn't just explode, it roared, sending a geyser of shale and snow erupting into the narrow pass below. The led horse screamed, rearing back and throwing its rider into the dark abyss of the canyon. Chaos reigned. "Now!" Dylan bellowed, his voice cutting through the ringing in their ears. Sarah stepped out from behind the scrub oak. The heavy Sharp's rifle pressed into her shoulder. Below, in the cloud of dust and smoke, muzzle flashes sparked like fireflies. Hatcher's men were shooting blindly at the cliffs. Sarah found a shadow trying to mount a panicked horse. She didn't think of the man. She thought of the pine cone. She exhaled, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked violently. Below, the shadow crumpled. "Reload!" Dylan commanded, firing his repeater in rapid succession, suppressing the gunmen who were trying to find cover behind the rocks. Bullets chipped the granite inches from Sarah's face, sending stone splinters flying. She didn't freeze. She worked the lever, her hands moving with the muscle memory of 100 drills. But Cole Hatcher was a professional. Amidst the panic, he had rolled off his horse and found the defilade of a large boulder. He saw the muzzle flash on the ridge. He raised his Winchester, aiming not at the seasoned mountain man, but at the smaller silhouette beside him. Dylan saw the glint of Hatcher's barrel in the moonlight. "Sarah, down!" He tackled her, covering her body with his own, just as a bullet tore through the air where her head had been, burying itself in a tree trunk. "Stay here," Dylan growled. He scrambled to his feet, drawing his knife. He was out of ammunition for the rifle. He slid down the scree slope, a landslide of vengeance moving towards the road. Hatcher saw him coming. He fired, clipping Dylan's left shoulder, spinning the big man around. Dylan roared, not in pain, but in fury. He didn't stop. He crashed into Hatcher, the force of the impact knocking the rifle away. They rolled in the mud and snow, a tangle of fists and desperation. Hatcher was fast, drawing a boot knife and slashing at Dylan's ribs. Dylan was strong, catching Hatcher's wrist in a grip that cracked bone. They struggled on the edge of the drop-off. Hatcher, blood in his teeth, sneered. "She's dead anyway, Edward. St. John will burn this whole mountain." "Not while I'm breathing," Dylan gritted out. Dylan head-butted Hatcher, a brutal, sickening crack. Hatcher reeled back, stunned. Dylan shoved him hard. Hatcher stumbled, his boots slipping on the slick mud of the precipice. He flailed for purchase, his eyes wide with sudden realization. Then he was gone, tumbling silently into the dark void of the gorge. Silence rushed back into the valley, heavy and cold. Dylan stood, panting, clutching his bleeding shoulder. The other hired guns, seeing their leader dead and facing an enemy who fought like a demon, had scattered into the night, fleeing back toward Leadville. Dylan turned to look up the ridge. Sarah was sliding down the slope, disregarding the sharp rocks tearing her trousers. She reached him, her hands instantly pressing against his wound. "You're hurt," she choked out, her eyes scanning the blood. "It'll keep," Dylan wheezed. He looked at her. Her face was smudged with gunpowder, her hair wild, her eyes fierce. She wasn't the broken girl from the wagon. She was the queen of the high country. "It's over," she whispered. Dylan looked at the spot where Hatcher had fallen, then back at the bag of gold Hatcher had tried to bribe him with earlier, still sitting in the mud where it had fallen from the saddlebags. $500. "No," Dylan said gently, reaching out to wipe a smudge of soot from her cheek. "It's just starting." He picked up the gold. "This buys us a lot of distance, Sarah. Canada, maybe Oregon. Somewhere Hiram St. John's trains don't run." Sarah took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his blood-stained ones. "I don't care where we go, Dylan, as long as I'm not Sarah Jane McAllister anymore." Dylan pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "You ain't. To me, you're just the woman who saved my life." They left the bodies for the wolves. They packed what they could carry on the horses and rode north under the cover of darkness. They were never seen in Leadville again. The Dollar Bride became a legend, a ghost story told in saloons, the tale of the beauty who was bought for a coin and the beast who loved her enough to set the world on fire. Dylan and Sarah disappeared into the history books, leaving behind nothing but rumors and a legend that still haunts the Colorado Rockies. Some say they settled in the Yukon, others claim they saw an old couple matching their description running a trading post on the Pacific coast decades later. But the truth remains between them and the mountains. In a world that tried to put a price tag on a human soul, Dylan Edward proved that love, dignity, and freedom are the only things truly worth fighting for. He paid $1 for a wife, but in the end, they both paid in blood to earn their forever. I hope you felt the cold wind and the gunpowder in this story of the Dollar Bride. If Dylan and Sarah's journey moved you, please hit that like button. It helps these stories reach more people. What do you think happened to them after they rode north? Let me know your theory in the comments below. And if you want more gritty, true-to-life tales from the world of the Wild West, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next trail.